Tooling is quite often a top topic at a conference like this. We are JavaScript developers and we do love a healthy toolchain, don't we? But with any toolchain comes complexity, and complexity can cause problems of its own. I've certainly got a few stories of banging my head against a wall for 6, 7, 8 hours just trying to get something to run, let alone be productive in it. And our next speaker is probably going to have something to say about things like that. Taken to the stage, next up for the 2021 CityJS conference is Stefan from Berlin in Germany. Stefan works for Contentful in developer relations, and in this talk, Stefan is going to be taking a critical look at the way we use and build the web. We love a tool in the JavaScript community. There's always a new tool, a new best practice, just new all the time. But is that best for developer happiness and user happiness more generally? Who knows? Certainly, Stefan has got a couple of things to say on the subject. If you're enjoying this talk and have some questions, please do come along to our Q&A session, which will be starting after this talk concludes, as well as keep posting along on social media using the hashtag CityJS2021 and keep those comments rolling in wherever you are watching along online. Stefan, it is my honor to hand the stage over to you.
Hello, CityJS. Welcome to Did Web Development Lose the Right Direction? And this is a talk about general best practices. So better be warned. And before we get started, I want to point out that I'm wearing a JavaScript hat here right now, and I'm the absolute JavaScript fanboy. And let's dive just right in. So who am I? I'm Stefan. I'm based in Berlin, Germany, and I work for a company that is called Contentful. So in case you haven't heard of Contentful, Contentful is one of these headless CMS solutions that you can use to power your JavaScript sites, your Jamstack sites, whenever you don't want to set up and host your own content management system, but rather would like to just consume some API data. And before we dive into these best practices that we're all doing in 2021, I want to tell you a little bit about my journey of becoming a web developer. So as a lot of people, I did my first web dev gig. I did an internship at a small startup here in Berlin, and I entered the company, and this was the tech stack that I was confronted with. I was studying computer science on the side, and the people there were using MySQL and Apache Server and PHP. And even though I was, yeah. Can I minimize what? Ah, wait. You mean the bar? Oh, I don't see my mouse. Wait a second. This one? So you mean, all right. Do I just go on now? Now you have to give me a timer because we messed up my timer. So when I'm going over time, let me know, okay? Cool. So I was confronted there with this company, and what they were using was MySQL and Apache Server and PHP. And I was already heavily intimidated by that, because even though I was studying computer science, the people there seemed to know so many things. And I was honestly puzzled and a little bit like overwhelmed of what is going on there. Slowly but surely, then I moved my interest into the front-end layer. And for the people that are doing web development long enough, you might know that Prototype and jQuery basically did the same thing. But in this project, we had both, because more is always better. The whole shop was running on a Magento PHP installation. And then slowly but surely, we moved more and more things into the client side with the new latest and greatest, which was called Backbone.js, which was pre-React, Angular, and whatever we have today. And then at the same time, new first general best practices for the front end started to appear. So what you see here is yslow.org. And this was basically a collection of general front end best practices. And as many developers, I had the idea to become a blogger, right? So what you see here is my first blog. It was maintained by a few colleagues and myself, and it was a Jekyll thing. And I just set it up somehow. I'm not the greatest Ruby developer, and we made it in total to 5 or 6 blog posts over there. And the journey continued. Grunt and gulp disappeared, and more stuff went into the client, into the browser. Then I did Angular for a little bit, and I played around with React and Vue. And honestly, I'm incredibly excited about that. And I love technology, and I love writing JavaScript. So I had my first tryout with blogging already on this different blog, but then I started blogging on my own URL, stefanjudis.com. And what you see here is how my blog looked like from 2017 till 2020, and was using a very current and recent JavaScript solution. So you see some transitionings going here. And overall, I was fairly happy with what I built there. And I spent ages optimizing and tweaking and improving this experience. At the time in 2020, when I put that into Lighthouse, which is coming with the Google Chrome Developer Tools, which is an auditing tool, you see there that I had an overall pretty green Lighthouse score across the board. And when you go to web page test, which is one of these other monitoring services that you can use, you see there that the site at the time had a speed index of 1 second on a cable connection, which means that the majority of the site was rendered on a cable connection after 1 second. And even on a 3G connection, the speed index was still something between 3 and 4 seconds. So I was fairly pleased with what I built there. And in general, the rule is that when you have a performance Lighthouse score that is above 90, usually you're in the top 5 performant websites on this planet. So I was doing good here. And of course, I was leveraging all these common new and good best practices that we have. So I was using HTTP2, everything was compressed and minified. I had a module, no module bridge in there to ship no polyfills to evergreen browsers. I had proper font handling and was preloading a bunch of things. And of course, I was code splitting everything. And I spent ages kind of optimizing how and when the bundles are split. And I was enjoying all of that, and I felt like the best engineer ever. And then I came across this website because it was trending on Hacker News. So this is a random website from Italy, and it looks a little bit outdated, but let me tell you 2 things about this website. First of all, it is super duper snappy and fast. And second of all, it is still maintained to this day. So when I recorded this video, that was last year, but I checked today in the morning, and the last article on this website was written on the 15th of March. And when you have a look under the hood, you will see that it's including a lot of GIFs, and the markup is probably not that up to date anymore. But when you go and monitor or measure this website in Lighthouse that comes with Google Chrome, you see that it has a straight 100 score. And even the blog that I set up like 7, 8 years ago without knowing much about web development was outperforming the site that I spent so much time tweaking and optimizing. And I couldn't believe it. So I went back to webpagetest.org, and there's this one path under the /video URL. And what you can do is you can paste 3 URLs, and you get a comparison video such as like this. And indeed, these 2 websites were faster and outperforming than my site that I spent so much time on. So you could now say, well, Stefan, you just messed it up. And honestly, I think that could be. But let me ask you the question, how can it be so easy to mess up? So when we dive a little bit into these 3 websites, you will see why there is this difference. First of all, my website is way heavier than the others, and it includes just some words because it's a blog. When you have a look at the index.html page, you will also find that my index.html page is super heavy compared to the others. The CSS resources in that context don't really matter, but the JavaScript resources are also way more on my little site. Images, the Italian side includes a lot of GIFs and such, but the combination of these metrics lead then to a way slower speed index and immediately to a lower Lighthouse performance score. But how is the Lighthouse performance score calculated? So when you go into that and you have a little bit deeper look into that, you will find out that it is 15% calculated from the first contentful paint, which means that something meaningful, saying an image or some text, was rendered to the screen. Then it's 15% time to interactive, which means that the JavaScript was downloaded, parsed, and executed. Then 50% the speed index, which is the majority of renders on this page. 25% of largest contentful paint, which is basically this big chunk that renders at once. And 25% total blocking time, which is the time the browser is just busy dealing and executing the JavaScript. And then 5% the cumulative layer shift, which gives information on how jumpy the page loads. And when you look at these 6 metrics, you will see that there are 2 metrics covering 40% that are directly bound to JavaScript, because the browser is a single-threaded environment and JavaScript blocks this main thread. If you want to learn more about how Lighthouse actually calculates these numbers, there's this article from Carolina from Calibre, and Paul Irish published this beautiful little calculator. So if you want to find out what it takes to get your Lighthouse performance score from an 89 to a 90, you can play around with this one. And why is JavaScript so important for performance? It is important because when we ship things to the web, users don't understand what's technically going on. So look at these as 2 examples. Ideally, we ship HTML so that we have a quick and fast experience. But our users and customers and visitors don't understand that a button is visible and they can click it, but nothing happens. This is always bound to the fact that maybe JavaScript is pending, maybe it's a low-end device and JavaScript needs to be executed. But JavaScript functionality just takes time, and this is incredibly frustrating for our visitors and users. Tim Cadlake wrote a very nice and insightful article comparing the script-related CPU time of websites for mobile devices using different frameworks. And you see here that the execution time of sites that are built, for example, with React range from 5 seconds to 20 seconds. And now let me just ask you the question, how often do you wait 20 seconds to get a reaction after you press the button? Netflix was playing around with this idea too, and what they had is that they had a sign-up form, and they were building that with client-side React. And when you think about the fact what it needs to be included in the sign-up form is basically probably an email address, maybe a password field, some validation, and then you make a request. Do you really need a framework for that? They dropped client-side React and replaced it with vanilla JavaScript, and what they've seen is that they improved the time to interactive by 50%. And for a product or a subscription service like Netflix, there is nothing more important than getting people in as quickly as possible. You always have to remember that 150 kilobytes of an image is nothing compared to 150 kilobytes of gzipped JavaScript. Page weight is not equal page weight. So let's come back to my own little site. And I had the 340 kilobyte index file for roughly 400 words on my page. What was in there? So I hang out on Twitter quite a little bit, and some random person on the internet asked me the same. Hey, why is your index page so heavy? And after I received that question, what I did was like that I was arguing myself into, hey, it's still pretty fast. It's faster than the rest of the internet. It's using best practices. This is how we build for the web today. Basically, what I was doing is I was having the argument that it's okay because it's still lighter than the rest of the internet. But now looking back 2-3 years, what I actually was doing is I was just going into this argument because I was really digging the technology that I used at the time. So when I now remember, or when I look back, what was in there? So the site was built with a Universal JavaScript framework, which means that JavaScript was run on the server and on the client. And usually when you have this architecture, what you have to do is you have to tell the client-side JavaScript what data was used to render the stuff so that it can hydrate or rehydrate to kind of build the same state in the client. And past me decided to inline and preload 22 articles at an average session length of 1.17 pages. And I did all that for better performance. So I've thought that what I discovered there is that making a very fast website is extremely hard, but I want to question that now going forward. Is it really that hard? Phil Hawksworth from Netlify, he builds a lot of fairly speedy websites, and people usually ask him, hey, Phil, how do you do this? And his general response here is that he keeps it simple, the pages are pre-rendered, CSS is inlined, and the work is usually done before a user or visitor gets there. And he's not adding any things to his websites that are making it slow. So after I read that, I gave the whole idea of not adding things that make your website slow a spin. And I worked on another side project of mine. So what you see here is tinyhelpers.dev. It is basically a resource collection online for all these little web development tools that you will never find in Google. And I built it with a static site generator that is called 11t. 11t is Node.js based, and it's very pure, and its primary thing is to render HTML. It's not adding anything that makes things slow. And without any additional effort, and after finishing the site, I went into the Lighthouse monitoring, and I saw that I was pretty close to a complete full Lighthouse score without doing anything. And Zach Lead, the maintainer of 11t, is pretty proud of this. And he's running this 11t performance leaderboard. And you see here that of 275 sites built with 11t, the median Lighthouse performance score is an easy 100. Because the framework or the generator by itself is not adding things that are making the website slow. 3 years ago, I was giving this talk that was called Front-End Development 2018, What's in Your Stack? And I said on stage in front of many, many people that every website is a web app and every web app is a website. And I couldn't disagree more with past me, because where is the user's benefit of such overhead? So let's talk about the first real best practice that we see today, which is Universal JavaScript apps for content-driven sites such as documentation and blogs. When I started doing web development, what we had was we started things with HTML5 boilerplate, which had this little HTML snippet, and from there we moved on to build for the web. And it usually included a style sheet and then a plugins or vendor JavaScript file and something which was main or main.js or something that included the actual application code. Over the last 10 years, this now changed to several bundles that are optimized and split into the depending on the functionality that you're shipping. And we are inlining this data block when we have universal JavaScript apps to tell the client-side JavaScript what was used, what state was used to actually build the website. And I think this is beautiful by itself because it allows that the same code runs on the server and on the client. And this is just super nerdy and geeky. But at the same time, this means that the same code runs on the server and on the client. Your content goes, when you pre-render things, goes into the HTML, then it gets inlined into some JavaScript block. And then when you're not careful with your templating and with how you split things, you're duplicating everything in the client again, and you have to ship that down. There are direct implications, and you're making everything heavier when you're not careful with this kind of architecture. And is this really the best way for the user? What I hear every now and then is, hey, this architecture offers ways for the progressive enhancement. And if you're not familiar with this idea, let me just quickly tell you what progressive enhancement is about. So when people talk about progressive enhancement, everybody's talking about stairs. So what the idea is that you ship some base functionality, which is usually HTML, and then you offer an enhanced experience. This is usually done with some JavaScript. So stairs become escalators. And the idea is that if the enhancement fails, everything still works because stairs are still stairs, right? And I used to travel quite a lot over the last 5 years. And let me ask you this question. How often do you actually see this kind of escalators that are not possible to use anymore? So maybe the idea is not working by itself. Let me show you one example of progressive enhancement though. So what you see here is a side project that I was building 5 years ago. It's another resource collection because that's what I do. I make lists of things in public. And you see there that what happens is that when you interact with the search result or with the search input box is that the search results are updated inline while you type. This gives a nice snappy experience. In the same time though, the URL is updated. And there's some server-side rendering in place too, so you can always refresh and you get exactly the same result as after interacting with the JavaScript. And this whole form is also a submittable form. So when the JavaScript fails, everything still works in the same way. And the enhancement is that users with JavaScript can have a very snappy result display there. For me, it is always important to consider that JavaScript will fail for one reason or another. Because at the end of the day, we have this big question mark in the middle, which is the network layer. And depending on your scale, JavaScript will fail or time out for reasons. And you have to remember that everybody is a non-JavaScript user while they're waiting for your JavaScript to be downloaded, parsed, and executed. And there are pure and progressively enhanced solutions out there too. So when you look, for example, at github.com, and I bet a lot of people spend a lot of time there, and you want to make a comment under an issue, we'll find out that the endpoint that is accepting the comments works with Ajax if JavaScript is available, but it also is able to handle an old school post form submit to render some HTML. So if anything goes wrong or GitHub deploys some faulty or JavaScript that throws an exception, this still works. And even on top, there are some 5 old school HTML links. And for me, honestly, I'm very happy with this experience because I think that a good site should just work. So what's the enhancement that are people using these kind of architectures in the wild though? And let me just show you, I'm picking on React for the next 2 minutes. This is not because I particularly have anything against React sites, but I had to pick something. So let's go in that. So when you go to reactjs.org and you load it with JavaScript under a fast 3G connection, you will see that everything loads properly. You can click around and the experience here is fairly snappy. So I think this is a good experience. So now let's load reactjs.org without JavaScript and let's see what the experience here is. And I would argue that it is more or less the same experience. So the question here is, what does this JavaScript architecture gives or provides to the user? Because when we look under the hood, we will see that the JavaScript version is way, way heavier than the one without. And even after 4 navigations, it is almost 5 times the resources shipped to the client for the same experience. And this is not the React.js team's fault or anybody's fault, or it's a very bad thing. And I have to say that I was guilty of that too. Right? It is just, this is how we build for the web today, aren't we? But does this architecture really improve user experience? I'm really not that sure about that anymore. But what I can be sure about is that sometimes it is harming user experience. So when I was used to travel across Europe and the world, I usually get out of an airplane and I get an SMS, which is my mobile provider telling me what I have to pay for data in this certain country of the world. So this is in German, so let me just translate that for you. So I was in the Ukraine at the time, and my mobile provider basically told me, hey, Stefan, you get 6 megabytes for €2, but you have only 24 hours to use them. And that doesn't make any sense because as of today, the average website has a page rate or resource of 2 megabytes in total. This basically means that I, standing on an airport in a foreign country, in not speaking the local language, I can visit 3 websites until I'm running out of data again. And I think in this moment, heavy websites and these architectures that are not offering any additional benefit for me are really harming my experiences. Overall, I feel like we ship more and more data for the same experience. And maybe we should think about the fact that app frameworks are maybe for apps after all. I mean, Facebook is building Facebook with React. There is a lot of hidden complexity in this product. This is not just a website. And even when we use kind of web apps such as Gmail, I love Gmail. I think Gmail is a nice piece of software. It is incredibly heavy, and that is okay because it's an application running in the browser. Little fun fact about Gmail though, is Gmail has kind of a low data mode, and that still works in 25 kilobytes. And I love them that they have this still available. So it always feels like everybody out there is using the latest Angulars, the latest frameworks that will be released tomorrow. And actually, more than 80% of the web are still running on jQuery. And even though it always feels like everybody does these fancy JavaScript tracks, this is not the case. Compared all the major frameworks out there, and maybe 5, 6, 7% of the web are running on a JavaScript framework. And you see here that this is statistics from the Web Almanac 2019. It is the same case for the Web Almanac that was released 6 months ago. jQuery is powering the web, and the web is not as cutting edge as it seems. And boring at the end of the day is beautiful and fast. So let me talk you through something else when you do a lot of JavaScript-driven sites. First of all, you have the benefits that you have client-side routing in your apps. It's cool, right? You can change the DOM and you update the URL and everything is super smooth and super nice. But when you do this, you have to rethink or you have to consider that you are now allowed to re-implement an accessible navigation, because browsers by default are very good to provide accessibility features to assistive technologies such as screen readers, so that people that are navigating maybe with some technology are informed that the URL changed and are informed that maybe the whole DOM changed. To make a JavaScript application with client-side routing accessible, the folks at Gatsby did some very, very nice research. And basically what they did is they are advising that, first of all, you should include proper skip links so that people navigating with a keyboard and assistive technology can navigate what you're doing. And then you should include an area live region that tells assistive technology when the route changed and what actually happened after they clicked a link or a button. And is that worth it to re-implement that when you're not doing fancy things in the browser? Because ideally, I think that client-side navigations have a complete place in this world. And I would like to see more experiences like this, where you click something and things warp, move into one other state, and interfaces in the web that are just delightful and beautiful to watch and click around. And these kind of things are possible to build with the web today. What you see here is a prototype built by Sarah Dresner. And how often do we see these kind of things where it makes sense that one thing moves into the others? And how often do we use client-side JavaScript navigation to actually just replace the complete body and dump something else in? And even Ryan Florence, who is one of the co-authors of React Router, said that there is a chance that he believes that client-side routing in the web is usually not preferred. And that is ironic. There are also good other examples out there. For example, when you go to the Vue.js documentation, you will find out that they're not using client-side navigation or routing. And I want to believe that they do that for the mentioned reasons. At the end of the day, a great site should just work. And I honestly 100% believe to build sites that just work, you still have to know the foundation of the web, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it really a great site doesn't depend on the framework that you're using. It's not depending on React, Vue, Angular, and Svelte. And maybe we're having the wrong conversations today. When we're evaluating what we should use to build a product for our users, maybe we shouldn't say, hey, use framework X, use server-side rendering, use an offline strategy, because everything needs a service worker these days, and it has to run on the edge. Maybe our answers or our approach to these kind of things should more be like, hey, it depends. What's your use case? A great site can be built with React, Vue, or Angular, but I think it's more important that a great site is accessible, fast, and secure. And when I really want to get rid of one thing, it's this mantra of people saying, hey, it is just HTML. HTML by itself defines over 100 elements. HTML inputs have 22 different types. HTML evolves over time. So I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but there's a new attribute, for example, to control the button of virtual keyboards, which is called enter hint. Chris Coyer, who's maintaining CSS Tricks, wrote a 4,000-word article comparing links and buttons. And at the same time, we're seeing more and more markup out there that looks like this. HTML is not easy. And when we have a look at statistics and organizations that are crawling the app, for example, for accessibility errors, you will find out that most of the errors that we have out there are due to incorrect usage of HTML. And when you dive deeper, you will also see that pages or websites that are usually built with a web framework are performing a little bit worse than vanilla websites. And this is nobody's fault, but it's just logical, because when you use a lot of frameworks, when you put technology on technology on technology, there's just so much more things to know, which then means to more things that you have to move. It turns out that overall, we are not doing a very, very good job when it comes to accessibility. And at the same time, sometimes we have these kind of messages out there that we protect, that websites are, that third-party vendors are hacked, and thousands of websites are mining cryptocurrencies. While we have a security mechanism built in the web, what you see is a content security policy header, which prevents people from doing malicious things in your websites. And when you look at how many websites are actually using CSP, you will find out that it's only 11%. And while we're not using these technologies, you will see that we're shipping more and more vulnerable JavaScript, because it just gets more complex and complex and complex. Overall, I feel like the web loses quality. But hey, at least developers get more productive. It all started with Node and NPM. And I personally deployed my first service on Heroku, and now we have services such as Netlify and Vercel. And I think that's beautiful. We can deploy serverless functions very, very quickly with writing just a few lines of JavaScript code. And to build a product today, we can use services that are out there, and we can build basically a product on a weekend. But at the same time, the hello world that was maybe 10 kilobytes in 2010 became 40 kilobytes in 2020, while increasing complexity big, big, big times. And when I'm looking at this little side project that I was building 2 years ago to contribute something and running npm install on this project, it requires 700 megabytes of Node.js stuff. And I'm not really sure if this is the right thing here to do. And I bet you that the person from Italy maintaining this website only uses a text editor. Whereas to maintain this website, I need a text editor, I need Node.js installed, I need NPM and framework knowledge, and then I can bet and hope that things are not breaking after when I didn't touch it for a while. Josh Comeau once said that he thinks that it has never been easier to build complex apps for the web. And I agree. How many sites do need to be complex apps though? And where are we going with this trend? When I started, this was the tech stack that I was confronted with. Developers that enter the industry right now are dealing with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, frameworks, bundlers, hosting, and whatever is coming next. Complexity is king. And I really want to ask you, what for? When a year ago, I was starting a new project, and I was starting to build things like with server-side Preact, and I was running things in a function. And then I was just being reminded of like, hey, this is heavily over-engineered. And Jason Miller, the maintainer of Preact, responded to me and was basically, yeah, Stefan, maybe this is a little bit over-engineered. And ideally, we have processes in place to have this automated in the future. And at the end, I dropped everything for a little bit of handwritten JavaScript, which then meant that everything was more robust and better performing. So maybe we will have good enough abstractions one day, but today I still think that you have to know the fundamentals to create the best user experience. And you really have to remember that with the technology choices that you make, you're shaping the job market of tomorrow. And in the past, I believe that my job as a web developer is to build beautiful experiences and just build cool stuff for the web. But now I think that my job as a developer is to decide what tools to use, what frameworks to use, what to prioritize, and find out what the best way is to maintain this project then. Chris Coyier and a lot of people out there are building for the web, and at the end maybe don't know how to build a website because we have abstractions on top of abstractions on top of abstractions. This whole bunch of technologies are just piling up, and we are putting more complexity everywhere. Chris Coyier wrote this really nice article that was called The Great Divide, and he described that there are two camps of front-end developers currently. So there are JavaScript developers that care about Webpack and GraphQL and maybe some React and whatever. And there are UX developers that care about interaction design, CSS architecture, and accessibility. maybe it is time for our industry to realize that the term front-end developer is obsolete. And at the end of the day, your users really don't care about what you're using in your front-end stack. They care about user experiences. And I think we reached the state that we value maybe developer experience more than user experiences. So where does that bring us? And I'm maybe running a little bit over, so I'm closing very soon. So where does it bring us? I really love shiny tools and I love writing JavaScript, but maybe it is time for us to take a step back and consider the right tools for the best user experiences. So I was sharing the experience with my website here. What happened there? So I was running on this heavy JavaScript solution from 2017 and 2020. And I rewrote everything 2020 going onwards. And I used 11t. Overall, I reduced the page rate by 64%. The build time it's running on Netlify reduced from 4 minutes to 40 seconds because there was no code splitting, no optimization of all these kind of things that we do today. I don't include a JavaScript pipeline. And overall, the reduced complexity felt super refreshing. And when I did need some JavaScript, I went with custom elements that I'm using and just embedding in the HTML. Alex Russell from Google once said that he's part of the anti-JavaScript JavaScript club, and I consider myself today to be in this club too. And at the end of the day, I had a complete green Lido score with a lot less complexity and a site with a way better user experience. So you might ask myself now, or you ask me now, hey, Stefan, is the JavaScript-driven stack really that bad? And I really want to tell you, no, it is not. But maybe we should really evaluate when and how we use all this technology that we have today. And maybe we should focus on building sites that just work. If you want to have a look at these slides, they are available on my-links online. Did we lose direction? And I have to tell everybody that I own my-links online. And I'm Stefan. We're sponsoring CityJS. You can find me in the CityJS, in the Contentful booth. And thanks to everybody for listening. And that's me.
Stefan, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you for delivering it as part of today's conference. It's really important that we as a community of developers take a real retrospective and introspective look at the way we are constructing the web around us. Really insightful stuff. Thank you very much. I'm sure everybody at home will be joining me for our round the world round of applause. Stefan will be joining me for a Q&A session any moment now over on GatherTown, so please do have your questions at the ready and join us there. We would love to see you shortly. Not on GatherTown, please do keep your comments coming in on Twitter using the hashtag CityJS2021 as well as in the YouTube section. We've really enjoyed watching the conversation come in over the course of the conference so far. Fantastic.
Stefan, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much for delivering it as part of this year's conference. How do you think it went?
Well, I went a little bit over and I lost my timer, but I hope everything was still okay.
It's all right. We had squeaky bum moment here behind the scenes, but it all went fine.
Happy to hear that.
I think we're here now at the Contentful sponsor booth. Would you like to tell us really briefly what Contentful is and what you're here hoping to get out of the conference as a sponsor?
Yeah, so Contentful is a content platform or a headless CMS solution that you can use when you want to have a content management system for your JavaScript apps, for your Jamstack stuff. So usually what you had to do in the past is that you had to set up a server and kind of an interface, and then you had what you see is what you get editor to kind of build for the web. I think people doing that long enough are aware of that. This now changed with products such as Contentful, and what you can do today is subscribe, have your content management system in the cloud, and use some APIs, which is cool.
Nice. I mean, that sounds like it solves so many problems. I hesitate to say WordPress headless, WordPress CMS. Is it that kind of thing, but cooler? Is that right?
The thing with I don't want to nitpick on WordPress too, right? And I haven't used WordPress for a while. But the problem with old school or with older CMSs is also that they are not doing structured properly structured data. So for example, I did WordPress development like 8 years ago, and usually it's this big blob of data that includes some HTML and some formatting. And when you want to port your content into different areas, that falls apart very quickly. And with products such as Contentful, you can just click around, define what data you have, and everything that you deal with is JSON, and then it will not break. That's the whole idea.
I mean, that sounds like the dream, right?
Well, I build my stuff on top of Contentful, so works like a charm.
Not a dream. It's a reality, not a dream. I love
it.
that.
It is.
And I've had a little birdie tell me you've got some sponsor giveaways today. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we're in the pandemic and working from home now for quite a little bit. So what we're raffling is basically a home office makeover with the value of £500. So if people in the audience need a fancy keyboard, a new microphone, a proper camera or something, we're gonna give away one after the conference, and then we reach out. And we had in the past. So the past we had custom printings made for offices of dogs in the background. So it's up for the imagination of the winner. So I think it's quite cool.
Nice. Well, fingers crossed I win. I need some wood paneling for my office.
Well,
that looks a bit newer than this.
We will take care of that.
Yeah, I like the sauna vibe.
Yeah, the sauna vibe is nice.
So there's so many points we could pick up on your talk, but there's a couple of comments that have come in, not questions, but comments. And I wonder if you'd like to respond to them.
Go for it.
So one came from Andre. Another argument for building a resilient website that can work without JavaScript is that JavaScript can screw up if an error is thrown and not catched. HTML and CSS just move on.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth into this. Right, so when JavaScript blows up, there's a chance that it blows up badly, and this is the whole thing, where you enter this little weird state that maybe everything blows up completely. Every now and then you see the typical single page application, for example, that's just blank because something threw an error in between, or then it at least looks broken. But what I've seen every now and then is that you see when it's server rendered with JavaScript and the JavaScript throws up on the middle and everything looks working, but actually nothing is working because the client-side JavaScript was just completely breaking apart. I think there's a little bit of a fine line there, because I find myself always like, how resilient do you do it actually, and how much do you do of progressive enhancement? Because when you want to do the purest progressive enhancement, it kind of really depends, because sometimes you're doing double work, right? It's like the resilient way, and then you have the fancy way, and having every endpoint to deal with form requests and JSON requests is also not the easiest thing to do. But I think that is a very, very good habit to just have in mind, to keep in mind, hey, what happens actually if it breaks? And do we accept while developing for the web that it breaks like atomic bomb breaking, right? Like nothing is working anymore? Or if we just with a little bit of more work can say, hey, it's okay when JavaScript is not loading, or if I deploy a faulty JavaScript bundle, which we all have done in the past. I think that a little bit of care there can bring us a long way, and the users too.
I find it hard to believe that anybody watching along with this doesn't catch their errors in JavaScript, though. I would like to hope at least.
Yeah.
To try. So somebody here has recommended or highlighted a pattern that they saw which they quite liked. So I'll read it out and then maybe we can have some comments based off that. Regarding client-side routing, I recall having read a blog post where someone described to build a website in under 1 kilobyte and moved the navigation to a dedicated HTML page. It loaded so fast that it felt like a mega menu spanning the whole UI. Now, I've never seen that done in the wild before, but it sounds like a interesting way to tackle breaking.
Can you repeat that? Like embedding an iframe or what?
It doesn't say whether it was embedded in an iframe. Andre, I know you're here, so if you want to add some clarification in the chat, that'd be brilliant. But it was the navigation as a web page itself. So click a button to go to the navigation, and it just takes you to a separate page rather than opening up, I guess.
Yeah, I haven't seen that pattern. No, I haven't seen that pattern. Sounds wild. I would like to see that in action, Andre. Sounds like a little bit like the frame example we had like 10, 12 years ago or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it may well be. Cool. He's going to let us know when he runs into it again.
Yeah, shoot it
Fantastic.
over, Andre.
So for me, my question off of the back of your talk is, if you were starting with a blank canvas today, which direction would you take the web in? You asked the question, did we take it in the wrong direction? What would be the right direction in your eyes?
Well, I think that you mean starting all over in general?
Yeah, so if you had blank canvas, nothing exists, how would you build the web today? That's
I
a
think
big question, I know.
I think the how we built the web is actually pretty nice and beautiful, right? I feel like that when I started the web, or especially browser technologies, were not really progressing that much. That changed over the last 5 years. I mean, we have new stuff, not only framework stuff, but also technology stuff in the browser, like every month. I think how everything progressed is fairly cool, actually, and I like the direction that we took. I think what I would like, if I would have a blank canvas and like a magic wish, I probably would wish for the industry or how we educate or how we learn. I would change that a little bit, because I'm honestly a little bit worried about the state where we're going now. Because first of all, we're over engineering a lot of things, and it becomes very tricky for juniors entering the field right now. And I have this big question mark: what happens in the next 5 years? And this is not the juniors or the beginners' fault, right? But when you start learning for the web with a React web pack, whatever stack, and you don't know what's under the hood, we're not there yet. And I don't think that we will be there in the 5 or 10 years that the quality will be great. So I feel like that somewhere the industry or we as web developers, that's not technology changes or technology's fault, but it's rather we as developers, or we as an audience, or as an industry, we went into that direction to forget what is good for the users. Because honestly, there's one reason to use these kind of stacks, in my opinion, which is UI or whoever wants to learn this technology, right? Fair, on their own stuff. Super duper. Nice. I love that. I do that myself too, right? But when we have kind of a bigger project with probably, I don't know, 1,000 millions of users, that's a website that displays 1,000 words and an image, and this website is 3 megabytes heavy, then we did something wrong there. Then something is completely off. And I think that if I would have a magic wish, I would love us as web developers and an industry to consider the user more than we do today. Because what we do today is, before we build a product, is discuss technology before we actually discuss what the user needs.
Okay. And I think putting the user at the core of it is key. And I'm really glad you picked up on the experience that a junior or a new person to the industry has, because
it is wild.
It is. I'm teaching one of the Siegel Bob team who are here doing the AV today to code. And we've started with learn a bit of HTML first, then learn some CSS, and then learn some JavaScript. We've not even got to the point where we're thinking about Webpack. He's been very confused for the last day and a half watching all these talks. And I'm glad that you kind of identify that. If you were entering the industry, and this has to be a super quick answer, if you were entering the industry now, where would you suggest people focus? Is it on those core languages that sit at the center of everything, or should we dive straight into React?
Well, I think as of today, I think that the industry hasn't shifted yet. Everybody wants already a React whatever experience, right? I think it's very hard to draw the line right now. When I would give advice for beginners right now, learn what is demanded by the industry, which is probably a little bit more complex, but don't forget and be curious that there's a lot of stuff below, I would say. Because what I, for example, see in Berlin is we have a lot of React bootcamps, right? And they tell me, hey, we don't need to educate them for pure HTML, CSS, JavaScript, because then they won't get hired. And I see that, right? But so I think the important thing here is the curiosity, and to not think that JSX and HTML and JavaScript is the end of the journey.
It's just the start. Giz, if you're watching behind the scenes,
just the start.
Just the start. So we're wrapping up this Q&A session now, but I do have some quick fire questions, because we are trying to get the state of the developer ecosystem at the moment, and we're going to pick the big questions for you to answer. So rapid fire, Tabs or spaces?
Spaces. JavaScript. Node. Front end. Apples. I'm also good with bananas, but apples are a little bit fresher, I guess. Cool. Cool. Thanks for having me.